You really wore that tonight?
Sloane's voice cut through the noise of the ballroom, loud enough for the nearest tables to turn. She was looking at my suit, the simple charcoal one I'd worn 100 times before.
Let the man be. Not everyone can dress for the room they're in.
The laughter spread. I didn't respond. Then she turned, reached for her champagne, and let the glass tilt, just enough. The pale liquid splashed across the marble floor, catching the edge of her heel and the toe of my shoe. She looked down at the mess she'd made, then up at me. She held out one foot, deliberate and unhurried.
Clean my shoes or leave.
The table went quiet. Everyone waited to see what the man they'd spent 6 years calling a freeloader would do next. She said it the way someone dismisses a servant, casually, without hesitation, in front of a room full of people. 6 years of marriage, and this was the clearest thing Sloane Mercer had ever communicated to me. Not in anger, not in desperation, in performance. She needed the room to see me kneel. What she never considered was what I would do if I didn't. The Mercer family had built everything on one assumption about who I was. Those 5 words told me they still believed it. What would it cost them to find out how wrong they were? If you've ever been written off by someone who should have known better, this one's for you. Hit subscribe and stay with this channel. We tell the stories worth telling. My name is Darren Keene. I'm 41 years old, and for the past 6 years, I have been the most invisible man in every room the Mercer family walked into. That was by design. I didn't wear the right suits to their galas. I didn't talk over dinner about market positions or acquisition strategies. I didn't correct Grant Mercer when he made bad investments, even when I watched him walk straight into them with the confidence of a man who had never once been made to account for his decisions. I sat at the tables they assigned me, usually the ones near the kitchen, usually next to people who were also considered optional, and I kept quiet, and I let the Mercer name take up as much space as it needed. I told myself it was because I didn't need the validation. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was simpler and less flattering. I was protecting something. I thought I was protecting a marriage. I thought I was protecting the family of the woman I loved. I thought that if I stayed patient long enough, they might eventually see me the way Sloane once had, as someone steady, someone solid, someone worth knowing regardless of what his business card said. 6 years. I gave it 6 full years before I understood that patience without limits isn't virtue. It's just a slower form of erasure. Sloane Mercer was the vice president of Mercer Dominion Group, a company her father had built over 3 decades in real estate, logistics, and hospitality. Grant Mercer was the kind of man who believed that what he'd built made him the measure of everyone around him. When he looked at you, he wasn't really looking at you. He was calculating your position relative to his. His wife, Claudia, had a cruelty born from social insecurity, the kind that mistakes spending money on the right things for actually having taste. She had refined that cruelty into something almost elegant, a raised eyebrow here, a loaded silence there, the precise art of making someone feel unwelcome without giving them anything specific to point to. Their son, Preston, 28 years old and still riding his father's name like it was a vehicle he'd personally engineered, had no real opinion of me other than the one Grant had handed him at birth. They called me a freeloader, not always to my face but always in earshot. Preston had a specific line he liked, the kept husband, which he deployed at family dinners when he wanted to watch me react and I refused to. Grant preferred a subtler version of the same contempt. He'd look past me in conversations, direct questions about business to everyone else at the table, then turn back to Sloane as if she'd arrived alone. Claudia once spent 40 minutes during a Christmas gathering explaining to a family friend that Sloane had always been a compassionate person, said in my direction, in my presence, 4 feet from where I was standing, refilling her coffee with a smile that had never once been meant for me. None of it was surprising. What surprised me was Sloane. In the beginning, she had pushed back. Not forcefully, and not always with enough conviction to matter, but she had. There was a version of Sloane from early in our marriage who understood something the rest of her family didn't, that the most interesting person in a room isn't always the loudest one. She had loved that about me once. She told me I made her feel like there was a whole world her family couldn't access, something real and unperformed, something that existed outside the machinery they all sustained together. She had meant it when she said it. I had believed her because I had watched her say it, and she wasn't a woman who made that kind of declaration carelessly. But something had shifted. I'd watched it happen without fully naming what I was seeing. Each year she stepped further into her role at Mercer Dominion. Each dinner where the social pressure calcified a little more. Each moment she chose to laugh instead of speak. She drifted. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Temperature dropping in a room before anyone admits it's cold. By the time I walked into the Meridian Grand Ballroom on the night of the company's anniversary gala, Sloane and I had been living like polite strangers who shared a calendar. She dressed beside me. We rode the same car. We sat at the same table. And we had not said anything real to each other in months. We had become very accomplished at the performance of a marriage without any of its substance. I knew what the evening was. Mercer Dominion was announcing its largest expansion in company history, 3 new hospitality properties, a logistics joint venture on the East Coast, and a real estate portfolio Grant had been assembling for 2 years. It was supposed to be the night the Mercer name went from regional success story to national institution. The ballroom had been dressed accordingly. Flowers from a designer who charged by the stem, champagne that cost more per bottle than most people's weekly groceries, a lighting scheme that made everyone in the room look like the best version of themselves. Grant Mercer understood the theater of money, even when the money was borrowed. What none of them knew, what none of them had any reason to suspect, was that everything they were celebrating had been built on borrowed time and borrowed money. 3 years earlier, before the gala decorations, before the expansion announcements, before Grant Mercer had started talking about legacy, Mercer Dominion had been 6 weeks from insolvency. The debt load had become unmanageable. The credit lines were exhausted. 2 of their primary lenders had already begun quiet conversations about what restructuring would look like, and those conversations were not going in a direction the Mercer family would have survived intact. I knew this because I was the one who stopped it. Through a network of intermediary firms and structured financial instruments, I had routed $15 billion into Mercer Dominion, capital infusions, credit facility guarantees, private bridge financing, and personal guarantees on their largest outstanding obligations. No press releases, no board announcements, no conditions. No one at Mercer knew where the money had come from or who was holding the other end of every agreement keeping them standing. They had believed, because it was easier to believe, that the market had simply shifted in their favor, that the right partners had appeared at the right time, that the Mercer name still commanded that kind of trust on its own. I had done it because Sloane didn't know. Because if the company collapsed, it wasn't Grant who would have suffered most. It was her. She had built her professional identity inside those walls. She had staked something real on the company's survival, even if what surrounded her there had long since stopped deserving her loyalty. And whatever was eroding between us, I still believed at that point that she was worth protecting. By the night of the gala, I had started to question whether I'd been wrong about that. Sloane had arranged the seating. I found my name card at table 11, against the back wall, surrounded by junior associates from the logistics division and 2 vendors who'd been invited as a courtesy. The main tables, the ones with the good wine and the better views, were reserved for partners, executives, and family. I sat down without comment. The junior associates were pleasant. The vendors were nervous and talked too much about nothing. I had a drink and watched the room from a distance, the way I had spent 6 years watching the Mercer world from a distance, patient and observant and absolutely certain that patience was the correct posture. Grant took the podium and spoke for 20 minutes about vision, discipline, and the Mercer family's commitment to building something that would last. He used the word legacy 11 times. I counted. He did not mention the years the company had nearly gone under. He did not mention the sources of capital that had kept his vision alive long enough to become real. He thanked his executive team, his children, and his wife, then raised a glass to the room with the settled authority of a man who had never once doubted his right to stand at the front of it. I raised mine from table 11 and drank alone. Later, When Sloane made her way to where I was sitting, she wasn't looking at me with any warmth. She was looking at me like furniture she wasn't sure she still wanted. She sat down, accepted a drink from a passing server, and within minutes was deep in conversation with two colleagues from the company's marketing division. I heard her tell them she wasn't sure how much longer she could explain my situation to people who asked. That if she'd known at 28 what she knew now, things might have been different. Her friends laughed, carefully, kindly, the way people laugh when they are not sure if they're supposed to. Then Preston walked over. He made a point of examining my jacket, said something about how the catering manager owned the same brand of suit, that maybe I'd come in through the wrong entrance. A few people in earshot smiled. I looked at him for a moment, then looked away. Then Grant arrived behind me and addressed three business partners at the adjacent table, in the tone of someone sharing a mildly entertaining observation, that I was a man of very few talents, the most consistent of which appeared to be spending other people's money. The partners smiled. One of them glanced at me briefly, then back at Grant, correctly deciding that engagement would cost more than it was worth. Sloane was 4 feet away. She laughed. Not a full laugh. A controlled one, calibrated to signal that she was not going to defend me, that whatever instinct toward loyalty she might once have had, she had moved well past it. It lasted 2 seconds. It undid 6 years. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to yet. 20 minutes later, Sloane reached for her champagne with the carelessness of someone who had consumed enough to feel confident and not enough to lose control. The glass tilted. The pale liquid ran across the table's edge, caught the floor, spread toward her chair, and splashed across the toe of her heel. She looked down at her shoe. Then she looked at me. What happened next was not an accident, and both of us knew it. She extended her foot in my direction, slowly, with the measured deliberateness of someone who has already decided what kind of moment they're creating. She picked up a cloth napkin from the table and held it out toward me. "Clean my shoes or leave." The table went completely still. I looked at her. Not with anger. I want to be accurate about this because anger would have been easier to carry. What I felt was something older and more final. Recognition. This was not a woman who had temporarily forgotten who I was to her. This was a woman showing me, in the clearest possible language, exactly who I was to her. The champagne had not changed her. The audience had not changed her. She had been building toward this for a long time, and tonight she had finally found the room to say it out loud. I held her gaze for a long moment. Then I folded my hands on the table, stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked away. Not fast, not dramatically. The same composure you bring to leaving a meeting that ended before you walked in. Grant appeared near the corridor. He stepped into my path with the confidence of a man who has never worried about being physically challenged. "Walk out that door," he said, "and don't expect anything from this family. Not a conversation, not a courtesy, not a single dollar." I looked at him. "You still don't understand," I said. "Who's been giving money to whom?" He didn't follow me past the door. In the car, I called Mara Bennett. She was my CFO, the one person at Keene Meridian Capital who understood the full architecture of what we had built and what we had been quietly underwriting for 3 years. She picked up on the second ring. "Activate these withdrawal provisions," I said. "All of them, effective today." A brief silence on her end, the kind that meant she understood exactly what I was asking and what it would do to Mercer Dominion by morning. She didn't argue. She didn't ask me to reconsider. Mara had watched the Mercer arrangement from the beginning, with the professional skepticism of someone whose entire career involved separating sentiment from liability. "I'll have the notices prepared by morning," she said. I ended the call. $15 billion in capital commitments, credit guarantees, and structured financing was about to begin its exit from Mercer Dominion Group. Not because of one insult at a dinner table. I want to be clear about that. What happened in the ballroom was not the cause. It was the confirmation. It was the moment I finally stopped arguing with what I already knew. I had spent 6 years funding a life I was not permitted to be part of. I had protected people who believed they were protecting themselves. I had stayed silent while they built a story in which I was the burden, and I had let that story stand because I thought love required it. It didn't. Love requires honesty and basic human decency. What Sloane had offered me tonight, in front of a room full of witnesses, was neither. And the version of me that had been willing to absorb that was gone. I was done trying to save a marriage. It was time to save myself. The first call came at 7:42 the following morning. I know the time because I was already awake, sitting at the window of the apartment I'd moved into 6 months earlier, when Sloane and I had, without announcement or formal acknowledgement, stopped sharing a bedroom. The apartment was spare and clean, and mine in a way the Mercer estate had never been. No one had ever looked at anything in it with contempt. No one had ever looked at me across a room in it and calculated what I was worth to them. I was drinking coffee when Mara's name lit up my phone. "It's starting," she said. By 8 that morning, Mercer Dominion's Treasury team had received formal notice that a $4.8 billion revolving credit facility, maintained through structured instruments by one of Keene Meridian's affiliated vehicles, would not be renewed at the end of its current term. The term ended in 30 days. That alone would not have been catastrophic if the company had alternative liquidity. It didn't. 30 minutes after the credit notice arrived, a private equity fund notified Mercer's legal team that it was exercising its contractual right to require a share buyback, a clause that had been dormant for 2 years, held in place by a side agreement that no longer existed now that Keene Meridian had withdrawn its support. 2 of Mercer's primary lending banks, discovering that their largest guarantor had exited its positions, immediately demanded additional collateral, and a flagship hotel development on the eastern seaboard, the project Grant had announced at the gala the night before as proof of the family's forward momentum, had its financing suspended pending review. By noon, Mercer Dominion's executive team was in emergency session. By mid-afternoon, Grant had convinced himself that a competitor was orchestrating a coordinated financial attack against them. It was the most flattering explanation available to a man who could not yet conceive of a simpler one, and so it was the one he chose. Preston told the room not to worry, that these were minor liquidity pressures, that a few phone calls would resolve everything, that the Mercer name alone would bring the lenders back to the table. No one in the room believed him, but no one said so, because Grant was present, and the Mercers had never cultivated a culture that tolerated honest disagreement from within. That particular habit, the refusal to let reality speak plainly inside the family, had cost them more than they knew. What they were discovering, slowly and with increasing alarm, was that nearly every financial lifeline they'd relied on for 3 years traced back to the same source. Different fund names, different legal structures, different geographic registrations. But one parent entity underneath all of it, Keene Meridian Capital. They cross-referenced the name across their files, had their analysts pull every associated filing, and the picture that assembled itself was not the profile of a competitor. It was the profile of a single, deliberate, sustained intervention. Someone had been holding them up quietly from the inside. The name Keene Meridian Capital still meant nothing to them. Not yet. Sloane came to me 2 days after the gala. She arrived at my apartment without calling ahead. She still had the address from a period when she occasionally stopped by, before we'd both silently agreed to stop pretending those visits meant anything. I opened the door and she walked in without waiting to be invited, the way she always moved through spaces she had decided were hers by right. She was dressed for the office, which told me she'd come directly from work, which told me the office was no longer a place she could remain still in. She stood in the center of the room and looked at me the same way she had for years, with the focused, slightly irritated expression of a woman confronting a problem that has failed to resolve itself. "You need to come back," she said. "There's a situation with the company's financing, and it's not a good time for personal complications to be affecting decisions." She didn't apologize. She didn't reference what had happened in the ballroom 2 nights earlier. She had filed it somewhere, reclassified it as an unfortunate episode, a moment of poor judgment on everyone's part, something to be managed rather than examined. She spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone who had reframed a betrayal as an administrative inconvenience and was now expecting me to do the same. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," she said. I told her I wasn't coming back. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite surprise, more like the recalibration of someone who expected a familiar outcome and encountered something they hadn't prepared for. She left without pressing further. But as she walked out, I saw it register. I was not afraid of losing her. I hadn't been for a while. She was only now beginning to understand that, and the understanding sat on her face like news she hadn't asked for. What neither Sloan nor Grant had connected yet was the name on the financial notices piling up on Mercer's legal team's desks. Keene Meridian Capital. The same last name as the man they'd spent 6 years dismissing across dinner tables and ballrooms and family gatherings. The same name I'd been carrying quietly through every one of those rooms without ever volunteering what it was attached to. That connection was about to become impossible to avoid. Grant contacted Keene Meridian's offices directly to request an emergency meeting with whoever held decision-making authority. He framed the request as an urgent restructuring consultation and made a point of emphasizing the scale of exposure on both sides, as if reminding the other party that they, too, had something to lose. A meeting was scheduled at a neutral location, a law firm's conference room in the center of the city. Grant prepared as though he were walking into a negotiation with someone he could study, pressure, and ultimately outmaneuver. He had been outmaneuvering people in rooms for 3 decades. He believed it was simply what he did. He brought Claudia, whose presence he always used as a display of family solidarity. He brought Preston, who arrived with a legal pad he would not write a single word on. And he brought Sloan, who sat at the corner of the long table with the contained expression of someone holding a great deal of internal noise very carefully in place. I arrived 4 minutes after they did. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows and a long table that seated 12. When I walked through the door, Grant's reaction was immediate, a flash of irritation crossing his face, the expression of a man who interprets every unexpected variable as a personal offense directed at him specifically. He started to speak. I crossed the room without looking at him and sat down at the head of the table. "Who let you in here?" he said. Mara, standing to my left, waited exactly long enough for the question to settle into the silence of the room before she answered it. "This is Darren Keene," she said, "founder and controlling shareholder of Keene Meridian Capital." The room went a specific kind of silent, not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who are recalculating everything simultaneously and haven't yet arrived at a conclusion. Preston looked at his father. Claudia looked at me, then at the portfolio in Mara's hands, then back at me. Grant's expression moved through 3 distinct stages in the space of roughly 4 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, and then something colder and more calculated that I recognized from years of observation as the face he wore when he was pivoting to a new strategy. Sloan said nothing. She looked at me, and I watched the arithmetic begin behind her eyes. Mara opened the portfolio and walked the room through the financial architecture without sentiment or preamble. 3 years of structured financing, 14 separate instruments across 9 affiliated entities, $15 billion in total exposure, capital infusions, credit guarantees, and personal liability coverage on Mercer Dominion's largest outstanding obligations. Every figure documented, every disbursement traceable through a chain of records that had been maintained with the same precision I applied to everything I built. The invisible foundation that had kept their company standing while Grant gave speeches about legacy, and Preston mocked my suits, and Claudia explained my wife's compassion to her friends while I stood within earshot. The man they had spent 6 years treating as furniture had been the building's load-bearing wall. Sloane's face, when I finally allowed myself to look at her directly, was unreadable in a way I hadn't seen before. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She was doing the arithmetic of someone who has just realized that everything they believed about the shape of their own life was constructed on a foundation they never once thought to examine. I watched her arrive, slowly and with visible effort, at the sentence I had spoken in the hotel corridor 2 nights earlier. She understood it now, fully, in a way she hadn't been able to then. "You still don't understand who's been giving money to whom." Grant recovered faster than the others. That had always been one thing I credited him with. He did not spend long in genuine reckoning before his instincts redirected him toward offense. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge what the documents meant about how his family had treated me. Instead, he leaned forward and began rewriting the story in real time, accusing me of deliberate deception, insisting that concealing my identity within a marriage was a form of manipulation designed to give me leverage over his family, framing the entire 3-year arrangement, not as the act of protection it had been, but as an elaborate long game. He announced that his lawyers would examine every instrument in the portfolio for evidence of coercion or fraud. It was an impressive performance, the performance of a man who understood that if he could not refute the facts, he had to attack the story they were being placed inside. Preston said almost nothing. He had the instinct, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, to understand that this was not a room where his usual posture would serve him. Sloane stayed after her father and brother left. She sat across from me at the empty table, and for a moment she looked like the person I had married, before she'd learned to perform constantly, before the Mercer machinery had ground down every authentic instinct she possessed into something smoother and more manageable. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She told me that if I truly loved her, I would continue the financing, that families go through difficulties, that what her family had done to me was regrettable, but it wasn't sufficient grounds for destroying what 3 decades of work had built. That I needed, she said, to separate my personal feelings from my professional decisions. She delivered all of this with the measured certainty of someone who had rehearsed the argument on the drive over and believed it would land. I asked her one question. If I didn't have $15 billion behind me, what would you be asking me to do right now? She didn't answer. Not because she lacked one, because the honest answer was the one thing she couldn't say aloud without it becoming a permanent part of the record between us. The silence was its own answer, and we both understood it. I stood up and collected my jacket. That evening, Sloane went to her father's house. And there, in the study where Grant had built his strategies across 3 decades, she handed him something I had not anticipated. She had gone through the financial records from our shared accounts during the early years of our marriage, documents I'd left accessible in a joint folder because I had believed, with the particular naivety of someone who trusted what they had built, that marriage was a context in which accessibility was not a liability. There were records of asset transfers and legal structures that connected my personal holdings to the Mercer financing in ways that could potentially be characterized as long-term commitments rather than discretionary arrangements. I want to be precise about what she did and why, because reducing it to simple villainy would be dishonest and wouldn't serve the truth of what actually happened. Sloane was not cruel the way her father was. But when she faced the loss of everything that had defined her position in the world, she made a deliberate and fully conscious choice. She knew what she was handing Grant. She understood what he would do with it. She chose to proceed anyway. Not because she had been pressured into it, not because she didn't understand the cost, but because she had concluded that the survival of the Mercer name was worth more than what she was doing to me. That was the part that stayed with me longest after everything else had settled. Not the betrayal itself. The fact that she had thought it through with clarity and proceeded anyway. Within 48 hours, Grant's legal team filed for an emergency injunction. They argued that a portion of the Keene Meridian capital structure had become commingled with marital assets during our marriage, and that a specific signed commitment document established the $15 billion as a long-term financing pledge that could not be unilaterally revoked. A judge issued a temporary restraining order blocking Keene Meridian from withdrawing a portion of the capital pending resolution of the dispute. Mercer's team also began circulating a narrative to financial media suggesting that I was using the withdrawal as retaliation for a domestic dispute, framing me as the aggressor, Grant as the measured businessman seeking only stability and fairness. 2 of my smaller institutional partners sent carefully worded messages about optics and exposure. Not withdrawing, just watching, which meant I needed to resolve this quickly, cleanly, and without ambiguity. 3 days after the injunction landed, I sat at my desk late in the evening and went through the supporting documents Grant's lawyers had filed. I went line by line through the execution records, cross-referencing the authentication logs from Keene Meridian's internal approval system with methodical patience, the way I approached everything I needed to understand completely. A date stopped me. The signing date on the commitment instrument at the center of Grant's case fell during a window when I had been abroad for 11 days, attending a series of private investor meetings. I had my travel records, my hotel confirmations, time-stamped communications from throughout that trip, and signed attestations from 3 individuals who had been present across those meetings. I had been thousands of miles away when that document was supposedly executed and countersigned. More than that, the document bore a digital authentication stamp from Keene Meridian's internal approval system. When I pulled the approval logs, the stamp reference number did not exist anywhere in our records. It had never been generated by our system. Someone had constructed the authentication from the outside, assembled it carefully to appear legitimate to anyone who didn't have access to the internal records that would have produced it. Grant Mercer had filed a forged document with a federal court. I sat with that knowledge for a long time before I reached for my phone. Not because I was uncertain about what to do next, but because I needed to be honest with myself about what I was feeling. There was no satisfaction in it yet, only a kind of deep, settled clarity that arrives when the final ambiguity in a situation resolves itself and the picture becomes complete. I had spent weeks wondering whether any version of this outcome preserved something worth preserving, a remnant of the marriage, a moment of genuine accountability from the Mercers, something that would have made the years of protection mean something beyond what they had actually produced. I went home that night to the spare apartment. I sat without turning on the lights. I removed the wedding ring from my left hand and held it for a moment in my palm. Then I set it on the table by the window and left it there. The marriage had not ended in the ballroom. I understood that now with the kind of clarity that only comes after you've stopped insisting on a version of something that no longer exists. It had been ending for years, by degrees, in silences, in small choices, made by 2 people moving in different directions who had agreed, without ever discussing it, to keep the appearance of movement together. The ballroom had been the last night I was willing to sustain that appearance. What Grant had done with the forged signature was something else. It was the final confirmation of who these people were when their backs were against a wall, what they were prepared to construct, what they were willing to use against someone they had already spent years diminishing. He had made my next decision not just easy, but necessary. He had given me every reason to stop holding anything back. My attorney had spent more than 2 decades in commercial litigation and carried the temperament of someone who has seen every form of human desperation dressed in legal language. Calm, thorough, and entirely without illusions about what people are capable of when they are frightened enough. When I laid out the authentication discrepancy, the fabricated timestamp, the non-existent approval record, the travel documentation placing me on the other side of the world during the signing window, he studied everything for a long time before he spoke. Then he said, "They filed this with the court." "Yes." He closed the folder, straightened it on the desk, and looked at me with the expression of a man who has just been handed something he knows precisely how to use. We spent the next 10 days building the case methodically. Every travel record, every hotel confirmation, every time-stamped communication from the investor meetings abroad, the complete authentication log from Keene Meridian's internal approval system, certified by our technology director and independently verified by a forensic accountant who specialized in digital document authentication. The gap between what the submitted document claimed and what the internal records showed was not a matter of interpretation or competing readings of ambiguous evidence. It was absolute. Grant had not stumbled into a technicality he could argue away on good faith grounds. He had constructed a fabrication, signed off on it, and submitted it to a federal court as evidence. The construction had simply not been good enough. The hearing was scheduled on a Tuesday morning in late October. I arrived before Grant's team. My attorneys occupied one side of the long conference table. Grant's attorneys, 3 of them, from a firm whose name was designed to suggest the kind of stability that was currently in short supply at Mercer Dominion, occupied the other. Grant sat in the row of chairs behind them, with Preston to his left and an expression of studied calm that had cost him visible effort to assemble. Sloane sat at the far end of the row, dressed in a way that projected composure. Dark jacket, measured posture, an expression that gave nothing away to anyone who didn't know her well enough to read it. I knew her well enough to see the effort it took. She didn't look at me when I walked in. The presiding judge had a reputation in the legal community for zero tolerance for procedural theater and a complete absence of patience for documents that didn't survive scrutiny. She had read all pre-submitted materials. The hearing had been allocated 2 hours. It ran for 40 minutes. My team presented the authentication evidence first. The forensic accountant walked the court through the approval log discrepancy in plain, precise language, what the stamp would have looked like if it had been legitimately generated, what the submitted version lacked at the structural level, and why no version of the claimed transaction could have moved through Keene Meridian's legitimate internal channels without producing the specific records that our system showed had never existed. Then the travel documentation was submitted alongside the attestations. 3 individuals who had been present across 11 days of meetings, each confirming my location during the precise window the document claimed I had been in this city, signing my name. Grant's lead attorney requested a 15-minute recess to review the newly submitted materials. I sat at the table during those 15 minutes and looked out the window at the street below. A Tuesday morning in late October, entirely ordinary and entirely indifferent to what was being resolved inside this building. A courier on a bicycle cut between 2 slower-moving vehicles with the focused efficiency of someone whose day had no room for interruptions. A man stood at a coffee cart on the corner, studying his phone, waiting for his order with the patience of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. The street proceeded at its own pace, carrying none of the weight of the room I was sitting in. I found that genuinely stabilizing. The reminder that the world outside did not require this outcome to mean anything. What happened here mattered to a small number of people in a specific set of circumstances, and the city would continue regardless. When the recess ended, Grant's attorney attempted a reframe. He argued that the authentication discrepancy might reflect a clerical error in the execution process, a technical failure in the digital workflow rather than deliberate fabrication. He argued that the underlying intent of the commitment was documentable through other means, that the spirit of the financing arrangement had always been understood by both parties as long-term in nature. He used the word spirit 4 times in 12 minutes. The judge listened with an expression that offered nothing back. Then my team introduced the second component, the piece I had held in reserve specifically for this moment. Beyond the structured capital infusions and credit facilities, Keene Meridian had maintained a separate series of personal guarantee instruments on Mercer Dominion's largest individual debt obligations. These guarantees had not appeared in the initial financial summary presented at the emergency meeting because they were held in a distinct vehicle and functioned differently from the other instruments. They had not been loans. They had not been equity positions. They had been personal commitments. My word, backed by my assets, standing between Mercer Dominion's largest creditors and the company's inability to satisfy those obligations on its own. Silent, unacknowledged, and about to terminate. The court was walked through what that termination meant in concrete terms. The $15 billion in structured financing was one figure. The personal guarantees covered an additional series of obligations that had never appeared on Mercer's public balance sheet, because they had never needed to. I had been absorbing the exposure without credit, without acknowledgement, without anyone in that family understanding what the arrangement actually cost me. In real terms, every year it continued. When those guarantees ended, Mercer Dominion would face the full weight of obligations that my presence in the structure had been masking for 3 years. Debt that had been functionally invisible as long as I was standing behind it would become visible all at once. I watched Grant absorb this information as Mara's presentation continued. First as data, then as mathematics, then as irreversible consequence. The man who had stood at a hotel corridor exit and told me not to expect anything from his family if I walked out that door was now sitting in a formal legal proceeding understanding, with complete clarity and for the first time, exactly what had walked out that door alongside me. He asked his attorneys to step outside. They conferred briefly. Then he dismissed them, a move that produced a moment of genuine institutional confusion in the room, and asked to address me directly. The judge noted for the record that she was not presiding over a mediation, that Mr. Mercer was welcome to make a brief statement if he wished, and that the court's ruling on the injunction would proceed on its existing schedule regardless of what was said. Grant stood up. He was 63 years old, and in that moment he wore it in a way he hadn't before. Not diminished, not broken, but stripped of the insulation that certainty had always provided him against the ordinary consequences of being wrong. He looked at me and told me he wanted me to continue. He said the company represented 30 years of sustained effort. He said his employees, hundreds of families, hundreds of livelihoods, bore no personal responsibility for what had happened between our families, and it was them he was asking me to consider. He said that if I had ever understood what it meant to build something intended to outlast you, I would see that his request was not personal. He said he was asking me, plainly, to help him. The room was very quiet. I let the quiet stand before I answered him. "I'm not destroying Mercer Dominion," I said. "I'm just not holding it up anymore. What happens next is the result of what was already true before I stopped. The company was in serious trouble 3 years ago. I gave it more time. What your family chose to do with that time is not something I can be held responsible for." I looked at him steadily across the table. "Well, I didn't cause this, I just stopped preventing it." The judge ruled from the bench within the hour. The injunction was dissolved. The authentication evidence was referred for review of potential criminal implications. A process that would unfold across the following months with consequences that belong to a story that isn't mine to tell in full. By the time I reached the building's lobby, Mara had sent confirmation. Keene Meridian's withdrawal process would complete without further legal obstruction on the timeline originally established. The final accounting took 6 weeks. Mercer Dominion's restructuring was administered by a court-appointed financial officer after the company's primary lenders exercised their rights in the absence of the personal guarantee backstops. The flagship hotel properties were sold to service outstanding obligations. The East Coast Logistics joint venture was dissolved. The real estate portfolio Grant had spent 2 years carefully assembling was liquidated at a significant discount to a timeline not of the family's choosing. The corporate headquarters, the address that had appeared on every Mercer Dominion letterhead, business card, and press release for 30 years, was transferred to a creditor institution as part of the settlement terms. Preston lost his executive title within the first week of the restructuring process. The reconstituted board, operating under the appointed financial officer's oversight, had no use for a vice president whose primary qualification had always been his last name. He left the building on a Wednesday afternoon carrying a cardboard box. I heard about it through Mara and chose not to stay with the image, because satisfaction of that particular kind, the satisfaction of watching someone diminished, corrodes something important in a person over time if you let it settle in. Grant resigned from the board before the formal removal process could complete, which preserved the technical appearance of a voluntary departure and accomplished nothing meaningful beyond that. Claudia sold the estate she'd kept for years, the same one where she had explained, in my presence and with a smile directed elsewhere, that Sloan had always been such a compassionate person, to a buyer who demolished it and built something new on the land. Sloan's role at Mercer Dominion dissolved along with the executive structure that had defined it. She hadn't been fired. There was simply no longer a company of sufficient scale or independence to require what she had been hired to do. She was 37 years old, genuinely capable, and accomplished in ways that had existed entirely independently of her family's name, though she had spent years allowing the name to overshadow what she'd actually built herself. What she would do with those abilities now was a question only she could answer. She found me one last time on a Thursday evening in November. She came to a small restaurant I went to regularly, near the Keene Meridian offices, where the staff knew my order and left me alone with it. I still don't know exactly how she identified the timing, though I suspect she had been watching long enough to feel certain. She sat down across from me without asking. That was still Sloan. She had lost a great deal in the preceding months, but not the foundational assumption that she was welcome in rooms. She looked different, not reduced, not diminished. More accurately, she looked unburdened of something she had been carrying so long that she'd stopped registering it as weight. The performance that had run continuously for as long as I'd known her. The performance of a Mercer, of a woman of standing, of someone who had never needed to worry about what came next, had gone quiet. What remained underneath was someone I might have built something real with, if she had let me meet her before the machinery had finished its work on her. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know what that's worth right now. I'm saying it anyway." I didn't tell her the apology was without value. It wasn't entirely without value. It was simply too late to function as the thing apologies are designed to do, to repair something, restore something, make it possible to step back across a line that had been crossed. There was no line left. It was gone, and had been gone for longer than either of us had been willing to say. "You told me you wouldn't have treated me that way if you'd known who I was," I said. "I've thought about that. I understand what you meant, but that's not the thing I needed you to understand." She waited. "The point was never what I had," I said. "The point was that you were willing to do what you did to someone you believed had nothing. That's the part that can't be undone. Not because I'm unwilling to forgive, because it's simply true." She didn't argue with it. That was the closest thing to grace she offered me in that conversation, and I accepted it for what it was. The divorce paperwork had been filed 2 weeks earlier. She signed what needed to be signed. I signed what needed to be signed. It was handled correctly and without hostility by people paid to ensure exactly that. It took less time than I expected, which is often how it goes with things that should have been done sooner. 1 year later, Keene Meridian had expanded into 3 new markets and launched a financing initiative specifically designed for small and mid-sized businesses facing financial pressure from larger corporate competitors, companies that used their access to capital the way Grant Mercer had always used the Mercer name, as an instrument of control over people who couldn't fight back through the same channels. The program carried no name attached to mine. I didn't see any point in names on things. I was walking out of a Tuesday afternoon meeting when it happened. The lobby had large marble floors that carry sound in unexpected ways, and I heard the impact before I fully registered it. A ceramic cup, a young man's sharp exhale, the specific silence of someone who believes they have just ended something important. He was one of the junior research analysts, 23 or 24 years old, and he had come around the corner at speed and connected directly with the coffee I was carrying. Most of it hit the floor. A portion landed on my shoes. I was on one knee before I could say anything, handkerchief already out, reaching for my shoe with the tense efficiency of someone who believes their career has just concluded. I put a hand on his shoulder. "Stand up," I said. He looked at me. "There's no version of this where you end up on the floor," I said. "Stand up." I took the handkerchief from him, crouched down, and wiped the shoes clean myself. Then I handed it back and met his eyes. "No pair of shoes is worth what it costs a person to kneel for them," I said. "Remember that." He nodded, searching for something to say and finding nothing adequate. I told him the meeting had gone well and that he should get a coffee before 3 o'clock, and I walked out through the lobby doors into the afternoon. The city proceeded the way it always does, in motion, indifferent, full of people managing their own lives without any awareness of the rooms I had been navigating over the past year. I walked half a block and stopped at a corner while the light changed. I had $15 billion retrieved, redeployed, and working in directions that made sense to me. I had a company built from the ground up, built honestly, in a way I could account for clearly to anyone who asked. I had an apartment that was mine, a Thursday evening, a Tuesday afternoon, a cup of coffee that no one else had an opinion about. I had lost a marriage and a version of myself that had believed absorbing contempt was the same thing as being strong. I was done grieving both. The light changed. I crossed the street. I had understood my own value for a long time. The past year hadn't taught me that. It had simply confirmed it, at considerable cost to people who had spent years insisting otherwise. I didn't need anyone to catch up. I just needed to keep walking. The Mercer family didn't fall because they underestimated a number in a bank account. They fell because they believed that a person without a visible title wasn't owed basic dignity, and they built an entire world on top of that belief. Darren's story is a reminder that your value doesn't come from who recognizes it. It comes from knowing yourself clearly enough that no one else's blindness has the power to shake it. If this story meant something to you, Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join this channel, because this is what we do here. We tell the stories that remind us what actually matters.